All right. Here we go. People are filtering in. Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. I'm just gonna sort of chat a little bit while we wait for the list to fill out. Here we go. All right. Welcome, welcome, everyone. Welcome to our little virtual event space. I am Allie. I will be the host for tonight. If something goes wrong, I'm the one to shout at. I am so excited tonight to be introducing Marie Benedict and Kristina McMorris to discuss the new novel, The Mystery of Mrs. Christie. So before we get into the fun stuff, I just want to really quickly thank you guys so much for tuning in and for buying books. Your guys' support really is what keeps this whole place running, and we love what we do. So if you also love what we do, go ahead and swing on over to the website or come in person. We are open every day now until 7. But we also do ship. So if you're not in town, that's totally fine. Shipping is $3.50 for the first book and then $1 on top of that for every next book you do, and you get to support USPS as well. So it's a nice little bonus. And I will be linking the books in the chat, so it'll be really easy to just click on over. While you are over on the website, I definitely recommend checking out some of our upcoming events. We've got a really exciting list coming up in the new year. Go ahead and sign up for our newsletter. It is just a weekly update. It's like 1 email a week. We won't spam you. And it's just exciting events, books that we have on hand, books that are coming out, signed copies of books that we have, blog posts, just fun bookstore community stuff that we're doing around LFP. Of course, you can also follow us on social media. We are at Third Place Books. And that'll just be like the quickest updates and recommendations and, just fun stuff. Like Claire just did your favorite, like books recommended based on your favorite Taylor Swift song from the new Evermore album. It's great. It's really fun and really sweet. So we are going to be here tonight for an hour. Towards the end, we will absolutely be taking questions. So if you have questions, go ahead and throw those in the Q&A. There is a Q&A box and a separate chat box. Oh, I see the chat is already started going. Oh my gosh, hi Ireland.
Yay! That's so cool. Somebody from Dublin.
Yes. So, we love it when you guys chat, throw comments, thoughts, greetings, connect with each other. We love to see that. Questions for sure. Make sure they get into the Q&A just so that we can find them a little bit easier when we shift towards that question part of this little meeting we got going. And I think that's pretty much all of the housekeeping that I've got. So without further ado, Kristina McMorris is a New York Times and USA Today bestselling author of Letters from Home, Bridge of Scarlet Leaves, The Pieces We Keep, Edge of the Lost, and Sold on a Monday. She has a background in directing public relations for an international conglomerate, as well as extensive television experience. Marie Benedict is the New York Times and USA Today bestselling author of The Only Woman in the Room, The Other Einstein, and Lady Clementine. She is a lawyer who spent her writing career unearthing the hidden stories of women throughout history. Her most recent novel, The Mystery of Mrs. Christie, offers an explanation for what might have happened when Agatha Christie disappeared for 11 days in 1926, claimed amnesia, and offered no explanation for where she went. Thank you guys both so much for being here. I am so excited to listen in on this conversation. If anyone needs anything, my name is Allie. Give me a shout. If things go wrong, they go wrong, and we're just gonna rock out with that. The rest of you, I'm gonna leave you in their capable hands. Don't forget to throw up your questions in the Q&A, and I will see you soon.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Hi. I'm so excited to be doing this, especially because Marie and I, the last time we saw each other was back in the first week of February. We did an event down in Southern California together. And we were in a room with like 400 people for an entire day breathing the same air. No mask. We were hugging, real hugs. Like it's so, it is so.
Imagine that today. I just can't even get my head around that, right?
The things we take for granted.
I did. I took a flight, I think like 3 days before everything shut down. And wow, I'm so glad we have this way to talk to each other and to readers and booksellers and librarians. But gosh, it was so different. And hopefully we'll get back there someday soon.
Absolutely.
I'm hopeful.
Yeah. And thank goodness for this kind of thing.
Thank you to Kristina for coming out. It's been too long, although we did get to see each other in person probably more recently than I've seen a lot of people. Yeah. And I want to say thank you to Third Place Books. I mean, oh my gosh, independent bookstores have like saved me personally during this time period. The booksellers, the recommendations, connecting us, book clubs, and librarians. And I'm so thankful to readers too, who are joining us on this virtual journey that we're on today and that I've been on for the past few weeks. It's been amazing. I mean, and to have people from Ireland and, places that we wouldn't be traveling to join us today is super wonderful. But Kristina's deep in the throes of finishing her own novel. So I am so grateful that she's here today.
Thank you. It's a nice break from staring at the computer, as you know, all day long. We're social people, that are not supposed to be. So, well, let's go ahead and first I have to tell everybody. So a book that I got an early peek of from Marie, but a while, it feels like forever ago now, but not that long ago, which because she's a machine, I don't know how she does it. Luckily, I like her so much. Otherwise, I'd have to hate her. Because the last book that I read that I got to read early and give a quote for, because I loved it so much, was The Only Woman in the Room. And what I love about Marie's books, which if you're a fan of hers already, you know that often she takes sometimes an unknown woman from the past that we should know about, or someone we do know about already, and yet there's aspects of them that we're clueless about, that we should know about too, such as Hedy Lamarr with that book, which I absolutely loved. And now we get to talk about Agatha Christie today, because same kind of thing. I think somebody that we think we know about, but really there's obviously so much more that you uncover in this book. So before you tell us a little bit about the book, for people who don't know much about it, I have to say, oh my goodness, book just came out 2 weeks now on the New York Times bestseller hardcover list, and Amazon Best Book of the Month, and getting rave reviews from Washington Post and everybody else. So needless to say, everybody needs to buy this book. I have it and I cannot wait to read it. I'm dying to finish my book. It's my carrot that I'm dangling so that I can start reading.
Oh, getting to that finish line of your own writing is like,
yeah, right. I'm trying. I'm crawling. But anyway, that being said, so Marie, tell everybody here a little bit more about the book that they don't know yet.
Well, it all actually, as with, most of my books, all my books really focuses on something very real, something that happened. And that is Agatha Christie's own disappearance. She disappeared on December 3rd, 1926, in the very dark hours of the night. She lived in Surrey in England, in a beautiful manor house called Styles, which was actually, they renamed it when she and her husband and young daughter bought it, after the manor house that she created in her first book, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, which was the very first Hercule Poirot novel. She disappeared. Her car was found in the early morning hours of December 4th, running empty on the edge of a hill that led down into a really deep spring-fed lake. Her car would have tumbled down, except it was like kind of lodged in these bushes. She was nowhere to be found, but her belongings were strewn everywhere, including a heavy fur coat, which would have been handy. It was a really cold night. People immediately kind of lost it, including the media, which was kind of unusual for the time. They didn't have media frenzies and paparazzi like we do today. I mean, today there's nothing that's not covered in the media, of course, for better or worse. But back then, things could go unnoticed, but people became kind of fascinated with this very mysterious mystery of this young woman. She was in her 30s. She wasn't the Agatha Christie we think of today. She had a World War I hero, pilot hero for a husband and a 7-year-old daughter. And she was an up-and-coming mystery novelist. And suddenly she went missing in circumstances that were like torn from the pages of one of her own books, right? It was just crazy. 11 days she was missing. With each day, more and more volunteers came out to comb the fields, dredge the lake, bloodhounds. Day after day after day, they couldn't find her. There were all these reported sightings, none of which turned out to be her. All sorts of constabularies were kind of enlisted with the task of finding her. At the end, there were thousands of people looking for her. The government enlisted Sir Arthur Conan Doyle to hopefully find her, because of course a fiction writer can figure out the whereabouts of a missing woman better than a police officer, right? I mean, you and I could just get that done. And then just as suddenly as she had disappeared, she reappeared on the 11th day claiming amnesia. Nothing, she had no idea how she had disappeared, the circumstances, why. She just was found at this hotel in the north of England, registered under the name of the woman who was reputed to be her husband's mistress. And I'll leave it at that. So yeah, so it was a very famous, I mean, this was not just in England, it was all over the world, New York, Australia, you name it, it was being covered. So it was a hugely pivotal event in her life. And no one knows what happened. She never spoke about it again. There was never any real resolution from the authorities. So kind of at the core of the most famous mystery writer in the world's life is this huge unsolved mystery. And I wanted to make something up. I wanted to come up with my own idea about what happened. So that's what I did.
The big what if, of course, absolutely, that we come across. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And then, so remind me, because I think I didn't know this before, but COVID brain. Tell me, was she already a writer, known writer when that happened, or was this?
Yeah, so she was, when we think about Agatha Christie, of course, we think of her in a very specific way, the perfectly coiffed, gray-haired matron in her tweed suit, sipping tea and writing her 66th novel. I mean, she wrote 66 books and countless short stories and plays. She had just published her 5th novel when this book came out. It was actually her really famous, still considered one of her best novels today, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which, for those folks who aren't familiar with it, is really like the quintessential unreliable narrator story. It's told from the perspective of the village doctor. There are a couple of murders. And for people who don't know what an unreliable narrator story or device is, it's when one of the people telling the story, one of the narrators of the tale, is not necessarily truthful. And you have to ask yourself the question, what part of the story that they're telling me is accurate, or which is skewed from their voice, which aspect of their voice and the facts that they're sharing is skewed. So it's so masterful what she did in this book. It's one of those books you read it and at the end you're like, oh my God, how did she do that? How did I not get it? And you've got to go back and reread the entire thing. So that is the book that was published the year before her disappearance. It was her most successful novel to date. It was very well received. And yet she was still very much like a mystery novelist on the rise. She was not a household name. She was an up and comer, and she was a woman, of course, in a largely man's field, who was kind of trying to make a name for herself. Certainly by the end of this whole 11-day scenario, she was well known, although not for the reasons that she would like to be well known. It was more infamy rather than fame for her writing, but she certainly did become somewhat of a household name after this whole disappearance and then resolution of it. But yeah, she was known at that time. And I think that's very much an important part of what's happening here. I mean, the Agatha in the, of my story, the Agatha that where we start, her as a young woman meeting her husband and those years up until her mid-30s, that is a very different person than the person on the other side of this disappearance. And that person that we have in our minds, the perfect matron, the creator of these puzzles that no one can quite grasp. And yet she looks so docile and, innocent, really harmless. And she was so much more than that. So it's really, when I learned about the disappearance, I was always a crazy Agatha Christie fan, freak, growing up in middle school. I think I started it then and I never stopped. When I learned about the disappearance, I was of course fascinated by it, but it's really when I went back into her life, which is what I do with all the women I write about, really digging deep, almost like origin stories, when you think of superheroes and their origin stories, digging and finding out who they were and what led to them becoming this incredible woman who made these significant contributions. Putting all of that together and looking at this disappearance, it really was fascinating, but more fascinating in that I felt like the resolution of the mystery of her disappearance would help us understand who she was and how she became the Agatha Christie of legend. Because I do think those two things are really, they go together.
What did she ever say about it? You said when she was asked, I'm sure she was asked this for a long time throughout her life.
Right. Amnesia. I have no idea. No recollection until I was discovered at the Harrogate Hydra. I don't know what happened. I don't know where I was, why I was there, how I got there. And, the times being what they were, I don't know how hard people pressed. I mean, today, no one would get away with that, right?
Right.
Could she have even disappeared today? I mean, people can't go anywhere. We're tracked 24/7. Everyone knows where we are. It was easier then, of course, much, much easier. But no, and it was known that she would not discuss her disappearance privately and publicly. And so after those few initial interviews, nobody asked her. I mean, she, in pretty rapid succession in the years after that, she became the queen of crime, the queen of mystery, and people weren't going to cross that barrier. And she didn't open herself up to it either. She didn't, she wasn't given a ton of interviews. She didn't make a lot of public appearances. So she wasn't going to fall into the trap of being asked some of those questions.
Right. And so did you always know about this disappearance, or was this something that you stumbled across?
No, I mean, I was a huge fan of hers for a long time before I learned about it. It was, I keep this like crazy long list of women I want to write about. She was always on it, but and I had this like hazy idea that there was a disappearance, but I really didn't understand how the magnitude of it, the scope and the infamy of it. I mean, I had no sense of that. And I really didn't understand what was going in her life leading up to that. I didn't know where she was in her career. I didn't know that her mother had passed away, who she was extremely close with within the year prior to that. I didn't know that she was really kind of caught up in the crosshairs of this conflict between what society was telling her as a woman her role should be and what she was really feeling called to do, which was right. Ambition was a dirty word for women in the 1920s. That was not something you should be aspiring towards. And then layer into that these very tricky marital troubles that she was having. I had no idea about all that stuff. And it was then when I started to pick it apart and then put it in the context of who she was leading up to that it just became, the whole thing became mind-boggling.
Right. So how long did you want to write this book? Did you stumble across that right before you started writing and researching?
Oh, no. I mean, this story in some version has been on my list. Like Carnegie's Maid was the book I wrote after The Other Einstein. I was supposed to write it then. I was supposed to write it instead of the Lady Clementine book. Right. I mean, it's been out there, but you know what? In retrospect, I'm glad I didn't, because you know how it is. Like when you sit down, people always ask you, how long does it take to write a book, right? Well, I can tell you from the moment when I say, okay, I'm going to write that particular book, but sometimes it can be years in the making, really, like thinking about it, dabbling in the research. And that's what this book was, like years of kind of thinking about it. And I'm glad I didn't write it before, because it took me that time to really put it all in context and come up with a format, because the format's a little bit different than my other books, and put it in a format that I felt was more in keeping with the story itself.
Right. And so how much of the 11 days did you envision before you started writing it then? Did you have a good idea of that?
That I did. That was new, all that part of it, because what I did with this book, most of my books are written first person. I'm sorry about that. I'm so bad with technology. I have beeping and stuff I don't know how to turn off. So they, when I first started to write it, and how I write most of my books is first person, really kind of picking a really crucial point in their lives and exploring it from that point forward to kind of tell the arc of their story, looking at their legacies, how they gave rise to the legacies, really sort of topical, timely issues that the women struggle with. And that's in there. That is, of the first 2/3 of the book, that is every other chapter. But each one of those chapters is interspersed with the 11 days, told not from her perspective, told from the perspective of her husband. And that was a departure for me, but I really felt like I wanted to bring the reader along for those 11 days because the theme of the unreliable narrator is very present. It's very much a part of the story in every part of the telling. And so I needed to do an 11-day breakdown. And that was all new, to really go back into the available literature, tons of newspaper articles and documentation to find out exactly what was happening during those 11 days, what her husband was going through from his point of view, the blunders he was making left and right, the different theories that were out there. A lot of people thought it was suicide. A lot of women had tried to kill themselves in that lake, which was near where her car had been found. Foul play. As the days went on, all these little unsavory details about the husband came out, and then he's the prime suspect. And the truth is, no one really knows if it was orchestrated by her, orchestrated by him, some combination of the two, whether there's this whole theory about her being in a fugue state. She like fell and, concussions. I mean, so many different theories. And that allowed me to play with that. And while we're sort of learning more about her, and then the stories coalesce, and that's where kind of my version of what happens comes into play.
I'm going to do a little quick break to say, if you have questions,
yes.
and I think Books is encouraging it too. And if you don't have your chat open, you might not see it. So go ahead. And if you have questions you want me to ask throughout this or at the end, please feel free to type them in anytime, because I will circle back around to them, or just let us know where you're from or something too, or other books that you've read of Marie's and how much you love them. No pressure whatsoever.
Absolutely. I mean, how many people out there have read Sold on a Monday? Millions of them at this point. Such a good story. Still stays with me. Can I ask, is it wrong of me to ask to tell about your new book that's coming out?
No.
It's October, right?
Oh, you silly friend. It was going to be October, but it might be moving a little bit. We'll see. Okay. But it will be soon. And I am really close to the finish line. So I'm excited, but yeah.
Can you tell anything about it, or are you not quite ready?
I can. I'll tell you just a little bit that I am. Oh my goodness. Maybe I'll have to come back sometime. Maybe we can come back together and I can share a whole lot more very soon, because I'm dying to. I'll just share that I'm circling back to World War II, which I haven't written about in several books. I stretched my wings all the way to 1930s in the last two books. So yeah, I know I'm growing as a person.
I love it.
So I went back to World War II this time. I always said I wouldn't go back to World War II unless I came across something that I'd never heard before, that I thought, oh my gosh, how do people not know this? Just like exactly what you read about. Yeah. And so I call that literary Advil, as you well know, that I've got the sugar coating of the story on the outside, and hopefully you don't realize how much good stuff in history get on the inside until you have digested it all, literally.
I love that. I love that phrase.
Oh, there you go. So you can quote me on that. Yeah, definitely cite me. So the idea with this one was I came across this incredible fun facts that are just amazing in an article years ago, but didn't think there was enough of a story. There was a nugget that was, we'll just say, that was used by British military intelligence during World War II, a secret branch that I'd never heard of before. And when I ran it past other author friends who, are heavy into World War II, like Pam Jenoff and Kate Quinn, and they had never heard of it before. So that got me very, very excited. And so I ended up delving into that. And there is, gosh, I want to tell you so much, but just know that the group was so unique in the skill sets that they had and the type of people they recruited that you will never expect, that they were so unique and successful in so many things they did. They actually kept it classified until about 1985.
Wow.
Because they thought they might have to use it against the Russians during the Cold War.
Wow.
The tactics they used were things we all grew up with, things that you all have in your homes, and you have no idea they used them the way they did. So,
wow, I love that.
Here's my suspenseful little dangle. Yeah. So anyway, so worked on that, almost done, but took a ton of research and insanity. Like the hardest book I've ever written at the hardest year ever. So,
right. Let's just throw those two things together. Let's make it super challenging and also be in a pandemic and a wildfire and
the wildfire. Yeah, we're Portland, so nothing gone out here. It's been a year. It's been a year.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I can't wait for that to come out whenever that happens.
Thank you. Yes. Sometime soon, for sure. We'll have early copies this year for sure. So we'll say that. And you'll get one for sure. Yes. So back to your research, because of course I love that. I know readers do as well. So tell me, which I always love hearing about from other authors, some of the most surprising things that you came across, if you can think of any.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, something that changed the course of your story even.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think there's so many surprising things that I learned and I think part of that is because I had such a very fixed preconception of who Agatha Christie was, and I think a lot of us have that idea, the grande dame, the British matron, the tea, the tweed, and that stuff is all part of her in her later years. And that, which is really when most of us envision her. What surprised me most was learning who she was. And I think, she was actually when she was younger, she was gregarious, adventuresome. And there's sort of one kind of series of events in her life, I think, that really exemplify that I found most surprising. So when I think I mentioned that she married, her husband was a World War I hero. He was actually a pilot, which was the Royal Flying Corps, was like the first of its kind. I mean, this was really the first significant war in which aircraft had been used, and he was really one of the first. And there's a whole other part of that. I think it caused PTSD and all sorts of stuff, but anyway. And after the war, he was really kind of struggling to find his footing into what he was going to do next. And he eventually got a position to help promote this huge British exhibition that was going to happen. And a group of people were literally traveling around the world, raising awareness about it. Agatha had just had her daughter, Rosalind. Rosalind was just a year old, and her husband was invited to go on this year-long round the world trip, and she was allowed to come. But of course, no one's going to allow her to bring her one-year-old. She had such a joie de vivre, and she just was dying for this experience that she actually left her daughter for a year with her mother, which I think is something we can't get our heads around today. The way we parent is so different. And certainly women of her class, she was of an upper class, not aristocratic per se, but definitely an upper class. They were very often raised by nannies and governesses. So for her, it wasn't so much of a stretch, but in any event, she chose to do that, which I think is also a little bit telling about her and just who she was, and a kind of conflict. She was a little bit conflicted about parenthood. But once she was on that trip, she was like not going to let any opportunity pass her by. And she actually became the very first Western woman to learn how to surf, which is like Agatha Christie and surfing are not two things that I would ever put together. But she became, and she was like, apparently, by all accounts, incredible at it. And she became the first Western woman to learn how to surf. So all throughout this trip in Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, she was surfing. And there's some amazing pictures, which are part of the family's private collection of her on a surfboard. So that to me was probably the most surprising thing, because it just seems so out of character. But in fact, it was very much in character with the person that she was in these earlier years of her life. So I loved learning that. And I loved, in terms of the research, I think for me, the thing that was probably the most meaningful, there's always like one, like one thing or series of things which really help develop the character, develop that voice, you know? I mean, you can get facts and dates and details from a lot of different places, but that voice, Agatha, when she was much older, when she was in her like 70s, I think maybe even early 80s, probably late 70s, she actually wrote an autobiography. People had been at, and she was, which was a huge step for her. She was a very private person after the disappearance. Didn't talk to press, nothing, but she had been asked many, many times, including by her family, to write an autobiography. So she did in private. And it's this marvelous, rambling, you know, account of her life, starting from being very, very young, living this idyllic life in seaside Devon and this sort of E.M. Forrester existence that, you know, was about to disappear, up into modern day, very pointedly leaving out the disappearance. There's zero mention of it. Typical Agatha. And of course, it's in those dark shadows that, you know, a good story is hiding. But you can hear her, literally and figuratively hear her speaking in this, because in the version that I bought, which was a long time ago, there was actually a CD included in it, and she narrates parts of it for you. So in her own voice, you can hear her reminiscing, and you can hear the softness in her voice talking about her mother. And it was really beautiful. And so for me, even though it's the voice of an older woman, you can hear just a little bit about the way she thinks and her emotions. And you can see her thinking about the arc of her life. Now, of course, she's like telling that selectively and through a lens. She's leaving out the stuff she doesn't want to share. But that, to me, in terms of the research, was probably the most useful, interesting, fun piece. And for anybody who's an Agatha Christie fan, I always tell them to go read it, because it's wonderful. It talks about her writing too, what she's drawn to, how she does it, you know, all that kind of stuff as well. So it's just a marvelous piece of writing.
Does she talk about in there what drew her to write mystery and suspense? Because obviously, as you said, that was not common, especially for a woman back then. So did she talk about that, or did you uncover that?
She does talk about that in there. I knew it already from biographies I had read, but to hear her tell it was really wonderful, because, you know, most of the messages she was getting at that time period, I mean, were, you need to make a good marriage. I mean, that was what a girl of her class was meant to do in the early 1900s. That was the message her mother gave her, everyone in society would have given her. But she had an older sister. She was a much younger daughter. There was an older brother and sister, and then there was a big gap. And so her older sister, she had a really interesting relationship with. She was very supportive. They were supportive of one another, but there was always like a core of rivalry between them. And, you know, it probably could have gone both ways, but I think in this particular instance, that rivalry is what started Agatha writing. So Madge, her sister, actually was a writer herself. She early on, when she was, I think before she was married, in her like late teens, early 20s, Madge wrote a series of essays for Vanity Fair magazine. And it was during that time period that she said to Agatha, they both liked mysteries, Sherlock Holmes in particular. She said to her, "I bet you could never write an unsolvable mystery." And Agatha was like, "What did you say?
Watch me.
You think I can't write it?" You know, and so that sibling rivalry, I think, fueled her. So that challenge like existed in her head for years, until that moment came, that spark came, and she suddenly, so during World War I, she served as a nurse, which was pretty uncommon for a girl of her class. And she found she didn't have an aversion to blood and guts and gore. And she also served as like a pharmacist assistant. It had a different name at that time. But, you know, back then things weren't necessarily in pill form. I mean, you literally had to measure stuff, and it was done in grains, and one grain could be the difference of alleviating headaches and killing somebody. And so she developed this really intimate knowledge of poisons and facility with medications. And it was there that she came up with the idea for the perfect unsolvable murder amidst all those poisons. And it was when she had that little light bulb moment, it kind of brought her back to that conversation with her sister. And she realized that she could prove her sister wrong, right? And so she started to write that first book, which was The Mysterious Affair at Styles, which she eventually did publish. So that's kind of how it came about, but it's wonderful to hear it in her telling, and her, so that the sort of cast of that relationship she had with her sister. And I think it was really pivotal because up until that point, her sister married really well. Her husband was very wealthy and she had had success as a writer. And it was at that moment that Agatha suddenly, like the little sister, came to the forefront and she had success of her own. And that meant a lot to her at that time and probably for the rest of her life. But so that's how she actually started writing.
That's fascinating. And then how much of her life did she put, you and I get these questions all the time, but how much did she put of her own life into her stories, do you know, and how much the mysteries kind of reflected her own life?
Oh yeah. I mean, that's a great question because what I did when I was researching her life, I was making timelines and putting them in historical context and all that stuff. But I was also reading the books that she wrote during different time periods. Now, my book ends in 1926. So I really only had her very first works to really dig into, for contemporaneous stuff. And wow, you could see so much of who she was and who she was evolving into. There's her, one of her, it's either her second or third book. It's a book not many even Agatha Christie fans have read. It's called The Man in the Brown Suit. And it's less of a mystery and more of a girl witnesses a murder, and then she kind of goes on this round the world quest for this diamond. And I don't even know what category I'd put it in, but it's written from the perspective of this very young woman, innocent, but determined. And you can see in it the Agatha that she was, the Agatha who had all these sort of fanciful images about love and what it would be like to be married. Is she incorporated in it a lot of that round the world trip, all the places she went, her character went. And so you really got this, I thought for me, it was really useful into getting insights into who she was, what her worldview was, what her view on relationships really was at that time. And then as the books progress, they get darker. The depictions of women start to change. You start to see a more jaded perspective over relationships. And then of course, I read past that time period, and she incorporated stuff in later books that reflected this time period. Although it's a little bit more oblique. And she wrote these books under a pseudonym, Mary Westmacott, which weren't mysteries. They were more, I don't even want to call them romance novels. They were kind of a blend of a bunch of different things. But in some of those books, you can really see the betrayal that happened between her and her first husband, and some reflections on that. But for me, it was really those first books that really helped inform who she was in those early years, little threads, the little unconscious threads that we put in things we don't realize that were working their way through. And then how she was changing, how her psyche even was changing, getting darker during this time period. You can really see it. And then as her life changes, it changes again, So it really makes you think about the things that you're putting in your own books sometimes,
Yeah, I imagine all the authors that we, writing in 2020 are going to have some, it'll be interesting to look back and see how art actually is reflected in periods like this, and looking back, the things that will come out a year, 2 years from now, and how people were affected that way. Yeah.
And because I feel like we're all going through something that is really unimaginable, something that even if you read dystopia, and I hate to think we're in a dystopian society right now, but you can't get your head around what it would be like to be in it. And I do think it's going to really affect future writing hugely.
For sure. And also interesting about readers, right? What readers are going to be drawn to. And then during this time and also in the year and two to come, that might be different than something that they read before, maybe something more comforting, or if it's escapism and travel, probably reading about a lot of travel.
It's funny. I've heard from a couple different, I've been fortunate enough to visit a lot of different booksellers as part of my tour. And two of the bookstores were mystery focused bookstores. And each of them had told me that they cannot keep Agatha Christie novels on the shelves. Much more so than they had ever done in the past. And we talked about it and really concluded that mystery novels, especially Agatha Christie mystery novels, you have a disordered world. You have an orderly world that has become disordered through a murder, usually, sometimes something else. And, her detectives come in, solve it, and restore order and justice. And it's very engrossing because there's this puzzle at the middle. So there's a little bit of escapism, but it's also deeply satisfying and deeply comforting to know that things will turn right in the end. And it was fascinating for me to see like what the booksellers are actually, and I'm sure that that's not across the board. Maybe it's just unique to those murder, mystery bookstores, but much more so than contemporary books, people were really drawn to those. So that may change as we move out of this time period.
Yeah. There's something nice about finding the solution in the riddle for sure right now.
I know. Could we please apply that to our lives as a whole?
Yeah, we said 2021 was it, right? This was it.
Please.
So,
can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Is it known, or can you talk about the fact that you have a co-written book coming out soon?
We're going to be working on it sometime soon. Once we all finish kind of working on what we're working solo at the moment. But yeah, I'll mention just briefly that it's called Band of Angels. And it is about the Angels of Baton. So about the nurses that were just incredible stories that we thought we'd never really heard about during World War II that were trapped in the Philippines. Philippines basically had are very much our equivalent of Pearl Harbor attacks, but they had it the very next day. So December 7th was Pearl Harbor. I believe, if I remember right, I believe it was December 8th. They had the very next day that I'll be diving into all that research once I finish my book. But so they had island paradise, just like Pearl Harbor. And then the Japanese invaded. And so they were there when it all happened, and what all these nurses did to try to keep themselves and all their patients alive, and all these servicemen that they wouldn't abandon, even when the Japanese soldiers were invading, and knowing that it was going to be occupied, and the ones that refused to leave. So it goes on and on. They're just incredible stories. And so I'll be doing that with Susan Meisner, who I'm sure you know and love both of these, and Ariel Lawn, who wrote like I Was Anastasia and
wonderful book,
and Codename Helene. And then Susan's has a new book just about to come out, The Nature of Fragile Things,
which is wonderful.
Oh my gosh, the cover is just,
I love it. I absolutely love it. I think it's my favorite of all of her books. For people who are looking for a suggestion, I absolutely love it. I mean, that really is just so good. That's such a great story and so timely, I feel like, because we are seeing the sacrifices that the doctors and nurses and people on the front line are making for us right now with COVID. And to look at that long lineage of heroism and sacrifice is really, really important. What an incredible story.
Yeah. And we came up with that idea right before all of this. So it just became more and more timely that we thought, oh my gosh, to be able to show sort of the unsung heroes of that time, especially nurses and people in the medical profession. It's never been more relevant. So
never.
So yeah. So we're excited.
Oh, that's amazing. Okay. I'm going to look forward to that one too. You have two.
Thank you. I need to hurry up and pop these things out, and then I'm doing a picture book with my youngest sister. She's an incredible artist, and we sold in a 2-book deal. So we are working on that. And
what is that about? Can I know? Are you able to say?
I'll tell more later because she's still finishing the drawings right now, but it's, oh my gosh, I just think her art is just so cute. So yeah, so it's kind of about a little girl that has to think of I'll tell you this, she has to think about everything that she wants to be for a school project, but the way her imagination works, she mashes things. So it is not anything that is standard, and comes out with these occupations that are so unique and funny.
I love that, and to get to do with your sister. That is just dreamy.
Oh, it's so much fun. I mean, she's so talented. She almost worked for DreamWorks and all this, and then she decided she wanted to come home to Oregon and not live in Southern California permanently. And I'm so glad she did. So she dreamt since she was about 4 years old of wanting to be, she used to say, I want to be a children's book illustrator when she was 4 years old, when everyone else was saying princess and, and ballerina. And she'd be like,
she's always known. That is so
always known. Yeah, which is amazing. So we're having so much fun. So anyway, so we'll be talking about that soon.
Oh my gosh, you have a lot of spinning plates, my dear.
A lot of stuff happening, and same as you. But so I will ask, I'm going to ask you one more question about structure with plotting, and then I'm going to rattle off some of these great questions people have been putting in. So if you guys have more, put them in, because I will come to them, because they're fantastic questions.
I see them.
But because you said your structure is so different in this one, and obviously that then possibly changes plotting. I can't remember how much you plot, but I think that you do. So tell us a little bit how that changed also with unreliable narrator. I'm sure worked into that as well.
Oh, absolutely. Well, as I mentioned, it's kind of the arc of a critical period in Agatha's life, each chapter interspersed with the 11 days of her disappearance. And then the two storylines coalesce. We come to the same point. She has disappeared, and her husband is in the 11th day of the disappearance. And then we have my resolution of what happened. And just before, I think I mentioned just before she disappeared, the murder of Roger Ackroyd came out. And I just couldn't help but think that, a woman who's been playing with this idea of an unreliable narrator so masterfully. I mean, if you've never read that book, you have to read it because it's so ingenious what she does with it. And she also creates these amazing masks and facades for her characters to hide behind, but so seemingly authentic, right? And I just couldn't help but think that a woman who was coming off of this sort of masterful creation and all these masks, she couldn't have just been a victim in her own vanishing, right? She had to have played some kind of role, and that this question, this issue, this possibility of an unreliable narrator, whether it's in her own story or her husband's narration, somehow had to play a role in both the way her disappearance was structured, and then ultimately how it resolved itself. And so the issue of an unreliable narrator is very much a part of the story. You'll learn kind of at the end how it resolves. But the more I started to kind of play with that idea, the more timely I thought it was, because I think we are all unreliable narrators of our own lives today. I mean, especially with social media, we're always creating, curated perspectives of our lives, very tailored visions of who we are, what we do, what we look like, which are totally inauthentic. They are not at all the real, for most of us, not all of us, but, and so that idea of an unreliable narrator seemed to me to be a very timely topical issue that I wanted readers to think about as well, as they were kind of unpuzzling what actually happened here. So those two things kind of went hand in hand this time around.
Absolutely, love it. So I'm just reading some of these questions that are fantastic, and so I don't think that we touched on this yet. You have to remind me if we did. But about because I know we talked a lot about what she wrote right before the disappearance, and really just in general after. But I'm not sure if you touched yet on what she wrote exactly after. And Christine here said, "I'm so intrigued, about that her work seemed different afterwards."
Right.
And then Ida says, "What novel did she write after she had disappeared? And is it possible that she was testing out ideas for her next book, do you think?"
Oh, I love that. I didn't see that this disappearance theme come out specifically. And my guess is that even if she was testing it out here, I don't think anyone would have anticipated what a media circus this turned into. Even if she had very specifically orchestrated this, and listen, what I wrote was fiction. No one really knows, because throughout all the many decades that have passed since then, there's no definitive answer to what happened. I think it turned into such a media event, such a press, crazy heyday. I don't think she would have written about it, because I think she knew that everyone was going to dissect that book and it was going to be perceived as her telling of what occurred. And if anything, she wanted to retreat from that. You know, I think the person that she became on the other side of this disappearance was very different than that adventuresome joie de vivre girl, right? I mean, she was reserved, very private, quiet, and that was public and privately. It really changed her. So I think if she had been kind of testing theories, which I like, I don't think we would. I think that was gone from any of her future books. Any hints that we see in her future books of what happened, like a betrayal of a husband, it's an entirely different context. But I still think the sentiments hold true, the perspectives hold true. And I think what I mean when I say things changed afterwards is immediately afterwards. The Man in the Blue Train, I think, is the one that comes right afterwards. It's just darker, and the stuff leading up to the disappearance gets darker, and I think darker and darker still. Not always. We have Tommy and Tuppence, which is like more like a little bit frivolous, but The Murder of Roger Ackroyd is very dark. I think a very dark book. I mean, it's masterful, but it's pretty dark. It's a really almost like a bleak look at human nature in a way. And I think how she was feeling at the time, very much it was influenced by that. But what's interesting is right after she came back from the disappearance, and she was on contract. She was supposed to produce more books. You can't relate to that at all. It was like a dry well. She had nothing. And she, after that, went on a trip. This was about a year after she had returned. After the disappearance had resolved. She and Archie, I hope this doesn't give away too much, they got divorced. And she went on this trip, and she went to the Middle East. And she ended up sort of visiting archaeological digs, and she ultimately met her second husband there. And it was like a new lease on life had been given to her, a fresh perspective, new people. She'd always loved history and archaeology, and she sort of got into that. And it opened up all these vistas for her to write about. And so she goes through kind of a little bit of a darkness, and then there's a barrenness. She really is like tapped out. And then she finds a fresh start again. And that's, I think, when all her best golden age of mystery novels happen during this, 1930s and 40s time period. And the ideas are just flowing. It's like she can't write fast enough to keep up with them. She draws a lot on the settings of her digs, Death on the Nile, and some of the other books, and some of the characters she comes across. And it's a very prolific time for her, but a happy time too. And I do love to see that, but she is different. She's not the same as she was before. So that's kind of what I saw in terms of a change in her.
Right. And somebody asked here too, a really great question about research. So I've got a couple of research questions. One of them is, did you contact her family at all as part of your research, and if you did, or anybody connected to her, and did you have any reactions from those people?
I did not contact her family for a couple reasons. First, I knew that they weren't going to share anything with me anyway. They're famously private. I know there's one authorized biography of Agatha Christie in which the family did cooperate with the biographer. And they told her that they did not know anything, that Agatha never spoke about it even to family afterwards. She never talked about her biography, never did an interview, and it was a forbidden topic at home. So I knew that I wasn't going to get anything there. And I write fiction, so I didn't want to stir a pot that didn't need to be stirred. This is very much my own version of events. It's my own Agatha Christie. It's not the real Agatha Christie. It's fictional. So I think sometimes I feel like if I could shed light even on my fictional character, I would reach out to the family. But I've never had that situation to date. I don't. And then again, you have to ask yourself, I am writing fiction. I'm not writing a biography. How far down the road do I want to go? And then I'm inviting a family to comment and contribute on something that is not necessarily, it's not nonfiction. It's not the tried and true truth based on facts. That's why in some ways I write fiction as opposed to nonfiction, because I want to be able to go places that the nonfiction places have left blank. It's in those crevices and dark cracks, places that we don't know what happened, that very often are the most interesting parts of the story. But if we were a biographer, or we were writing nonfiction, we could never go there because there wouldn't be the research trail that would be necessary to make those kinds of claims. So no, it's funny. There was actually a couple nights ago, a new documentary about Agatha Christie. There's always a new one. It's called Inside the Mind of Agatha Christie. It was on PBS. And what I'm saying about her disappearance, I was relieved to hear that it was more of the same, right? No one knows. She never talked about it. She was famously private. So I don't think we'll ever know. And so I felt like when I was reading that, especially the autobiography, and there was this dark shadow of knowledge, I felt like it was an invitation to kind of crawl in and use a little bit of fiction in there.
The what if. It's the what if. It's for sure the fiction part of what we do. And Kristina, we've done events together. My whole spiel of when I talk about Sold on a Monday, being inspired by a photo of 4 children being offered for sale, the siblings on their own front porch in Chicago, and that photo that went what we call today viral. But mine was completely fiction. It wasn't even about these kids. It was just inspired by that photograph. And the what if, from a reporter standpoint of how that one photo affects so many lives as a result. And I was asked, of course, all the time, if I reached out to the family, and I did become friends with the oldest little girl who was sold, but not until after I finished the book. And, it was amazing. And we became friends. But again, do you always want that phone call? Would you want that phone call on the other side? So I saw this photo of you as a child that was completely of you being offered for sale. And I wrote a book about it.
What do you think? Right, exactly. And then you have to worry too, is that going to influence what you're writing, your vision, your fiction? Because it is very much fiction, so yeah, absolutely. But your story, I will never forget. I saw you in New York after you had gone on, was it the Today Show or Good Morning America? Where you had met and discussed all the events with her. I mean, that was just so breathtaking. What an experience.
Yeah, I saw it. That was the first time we met. I think it was a half hour after the show had just ended.
Oh,
and I came over for the lunch.
To that luncheon from there. It was crazy. I just couldn't believe that. I mean, what a story, really.
Yeah, well, it's been a journey for sure, no question. Yeah. So I know we're getting close on time here, so I'm going to ask you, because of course, everybody always wants to know, right after you have a child, they're like, so when are you going to have the next one? So I want to know what book, if you're working on something new, because I know you always are, once again, I still like her. And the other question is what you're reading, or something that we'd recommend.
Let's do recommend first.
Okay.
I have been so fortunate to read so many fantastic pieces of historical fiction that are coming up in the upcoming months, early copies. One, of course, is Susan Meisner's The Nature of Fragile Things, which is super. Lauren Willig's The Band of Sisters, which is about these Smith graduates who go off to help during World War I, really wonderful. Kate Quinn's Rose Coat comes out in March, and that's, as usual, phenomenal, so good. Such a look at Bletchley Park and the women. And Kate and I actually collaborated on a novella about an overlap between Bletchley Park and Agatha Christie. And that comes out in February. I've read so many. Erica Robach's The Invisible Woman. Yes. Greer McAllister's Arctic Fury, so good, just so good. Yeah. Melanie Benjamin's The Children's Blizzard, also amazing. That I think came out a week or so ago. I was so lucky to get to read all of those in advance. There was another one that I loved. Oh, Chanel Clayton's The Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba, really good. So I feel like people who love historical fiction, there is just Patty Callahan Henry's
Surviving Savannah.
So good.
Oh my gosh, so good too. Like an unknown Titanic. We've read so many of the same books. I've read almost all the ones.
I feel like it's such just a wealth of really fantastic stories about women.
Oh my
God.
God.
I would recommend all of those.
Yes. Those are all the ones I'd recommend too. And I'll add two more for people, because I imagine everybody on here loves historical fiction. One is Stephanie Drey's The Women of Chateau Lafayette.
I want to read that
Her
one.
best work ever. It is phenomenal. It blows you away.
Okay,
and so good. And then Pam Jenoff's, I just got to read hers and give a quote, and that was the Woman with the Blue Star. So she's got another aspect of World War II that you've never heard before. It's just, it pulls you in by page 1. So, so good. So nice. You have so many books to buy from Third Place Books.
So many books. I do have another book coming out in June. Yeah. June 1st. I have a book. It's my first co-written novel with wonderful writer, Victoria Christopher Murray. It's called The Personal Librarian. It's the story of, we all know JP Morgan, famous financier, early 1900s. He built in New York City the Morgan Library to house his collection of rare books and manuscripts. It's a world-class, priceless collection. When he built the library, he hired a woman to run it. Her name was Belle DaCosta Green. She was she became the most powerful woman in the art world, powerful person really in the art world during the 4 decades she ran the institution. But she would have never been allowed to hold that position if her true identity had been known. She was actually African American. She was fair enough to pass as white. And in order to hold this role, it was the age of the beginnings of segregation. She had to suppress sort of her father's legacy. Her father was the first African-American graduate of Harvard. He was an advocate for civil rights alongside Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass. But because his legacy really had, I don't want to say failed, but had been quashed during his lifetime. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 had been overturned by the Supreme Court. Jim Crow and segregation was becoming the law of the land. His daughter had to really hide that part of herself and hide her identity to succeed in a world that would only have allowed her to succeed as white. So it's a look at this unbelievable woman. I mean, she was like a celebrity in her day. She knew everybody, it was a huge personality, very charismatic. But it's also a really chilling look at a really important time in our nation's history that often gets overlooked. So it was really just an honor to write her story, and such a special experience with Victoria for me and for her. It was really, so that comes out in June.
Yeah, yay! I can't wait to read that too. So, as you know, and so I know we've got 2 questions here, and if that's okay, ask them quick questions, quick answers, and then we'll wrap up. And of course, if people have to go, we completely understand. But people have been waiting so patiently, and we just had so many good questions and good answers from her. So one of the questions is really a good question, is how did your research change at all during the pandemic, or how did you research during the pandemic?
Yeah, such a good question. I was fortunate in that a year before, I think I mentioned I was going to write this book instead of the book about Clementine Churchill, which came out a year ago, January. And prior to that, I had gone on a big research trip with my family to England, where I actually researched both books. I did all the Churchill stuff, the war rooms, Chartwell, and I did all the Agatha Christie stuff, all the places she lived, during that formative 1926 and earlier period. So I like to visit the places I write about if I can. So I was so lucky to have had that experience, because otherwise that would have never occurred. In terms of like the hands-on research, I do feel like I got to do everything I wanted to do. In terms of the documentary research, I was lucky that I had assembled all the research material in advance, because I was going to write that book. I had bought everything I wanted to purchase. And my local library, while it wasn't open during this time period, and a lot of this book had been largely completed prior to the last bits and pieces that I needed to fill in. They were doing curbside delivery, so I could fill in what I needed to fill in. So I feel very lucky that I got to do everything I got to do. And of course, our books, for the most part, are completed a year before they come out. Not totally, you might still have copy editing and some additional stuff to add. But for that, I feel like I was very, very lucky.
And then the last question we have here is Audrey had listened to on Audible, Only Woman in the Room, and really enjoyed it, and had a question because that one, it was in first person, of course. Yeah. I both know, and wanted to know, especially with first person, do you find it tricky to draw a line between fact and your own descriptions, your own creations that you sort of take creative license with?
Such a good question. I think for me, I almost have to write these women in the first person. I find it, just from a writing perspective and sort of getting close to their more intimate thoughts, their feelings, I'm not as good writing about them unless I'm thinking about them as myself. I saw that. So in terms of distancing myself from fact and fiction, I feel like I almost am better able to blend the research and the fact with the fiction by doing that, if that makes sense. I find if I write she, he, her, I just don't have the intimacy with the experiences. And I also don't feel like the past is coming forward enough for me personally as part of the writing process. And I hope that comes through in the reading process as well. But I don't feel the emotional connection unless I write that way. And it allows me to kind of say, okay, if I am Hedy Lamarr in that case, and I am, at my husband, whose nickname is the Merchant of Death, if I'm standing on our balcony in our hunting lodge in the Bavarian Alps, how do I feel about the wind in my hair and the whispers of the Nazis behind me? So it allows me to kind of more firsthand feel the setting. It really feels like I can access those historical details a little bit more closely if I'm looking at it that way. So hope that answers the question. I don't know if it does.
It's great. Oh yeah, and we could talk on obviously all kinds of stuff all night long, but
question.
We will wrap up. So we can wrap up now. Just want to come back? You want to wrap us up then?
I'm back. I hate to interrupt. This discussion has been going so well.
I feel so lucky that Kristina, I know she's in that final stretch. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
It was a nice break for sure.
And Allie, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for Third Place Books. Wow.
Thank you guys so much for being here. I loved being a silent fly on the wall in this conversation, and I cannot wait to read this book. Everyone in the audience, thank you guys so much for being here. Definitely go grab the book. There are links in the chat, or come in. We want to see you. So thank you everyone so much, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Exactly.
Stay safe, everybody.
And stay reading, please. Kristina, Allie, everybody, thank you.
Bye, everyone.